Dear speaker, dear Patrice, and dear audience, we are opening today our fourth and last session of the workshop of ultra-fast broadband in Europe. This last session is devoted to financial issues, who is investing in USB rollout, and what are the place of public investment and state aid in this process. In our previous session, we had a different illustration of situation in European countries, in Portugal, Germany, Spain, Sweden, and today we have a point about Italy and French situation too. Thank you very much to Marc from SER and Harald, and also Francesco and Marie, who will speak to today. And thank you for this to have this last session in charge. Before leaving the floor to Pierre-Jean Bengozi and Patrice, just few technical recommendation. Please do not hesitate to chat and send us your question on the chat. And just another thing, the session is also broadcasted on the YouTube channel, please. So, I leave the speak to Pierre-Jean. I leave the floor to Pierre-Jean.
Yes, thank you, Anne, for this introduction. This is today, and unfortunately, dare I say, given the interest of the seminar, the last session of our cycle dedicated to the ultra-broadband in Europe. And on this occasion, we started by presenting and situating the development of policies and regulatory framework in Europe at both the continental and national level. And this was the first session. The second session give us then more specifically the opportunity to start to establish a state of play of fiber development, and more broadly of broadband in the Europe of 28, by linking the progress of this development with the objective of the European Digital Agenda. And last week, we then addressed the crucial and particularly sensitive issue of the cost of this development, the level of this cost, of course, depending on the geographical and competitive context, but also the factors that weigh on this cost, and also the ways of evaluating and modeling such costs. The way was, and the road was therefore clear for the last session, today's session, which consequently extend the reflection by looking directly at the way in which these costs and investments are secured and distributed between public and private investment. So in conclusion, it's indeed the question of state aid and the articulation between economy and regulation that we are going to talk about. It is at the heart of the evaluation mission that I'm chairing, and more broadly at the question that the Commission will be making to all countries, particularly in the context of public support on natural monopolies, that each country has in one way or another to the deployment in the most isolated areas. I will not multiplying the acknowledgement to all the contributors, all the chairperson, and we shall do that at the very end of the seminar. So I immediately give the floor to Patrice Durand. Patrice Durand is member of the scientific committee of the mission. He's a specialist of evaluation of public policy. So thank you, Patrice, for chairing and animating this session, and you have the word.
Thank you, Pierre-Jean. Well, hello everybody, welcome on board. I will briefly introduce this session, and this is the last meeting of this first seminar, as told Pierre-Jean, and probably the time has come to ask the question, who pay for that? Because if he told that the question was the big issue was that of the cost, probably the problem now is who pay for that. But if the connectivity is the solution, it is also the problem as far as the policy of ultra-fast broadband aims at covering all the territory in France and all in European countries. So the geographic coverage is essential, as you know, and it raises the question of articulation of public and private mode of financing. The answer of this question is important and difficult, as you know, for the public policy at large, because what is at stake is our capacity to articulate the different objectives of the policy, more or less clearly formulated: economic development, satisfaction of the users in their activity as private and as professional with the teleworking, for instance, the reduction of social inequities at large, and, in fact, territorial inequities, which often combine all the difficulties. The difficulties can be stated, in fact, in terms of territorial coverage. So it raises also the articulation of public and private investment, especially in rural areas. So because the problem is that of not of very high capacity network, attractive territories, but low density territories and rural areas. We know that a good connectivity cannot be the result, and it has very often been said during this seminar, the result of private initiative alone. Also, the recourse of the public authority is necessary, and it raises the problem of state aid. Because the state aid is concerned in at least three ways: as producers of public services, as bearer of industrial policies, and as regulator of both economic and social relations between the actors of society. So we have the problem of the articulation of public and private financing is raising the problem of state aid, as I said, and as also Pierre-Jean told it. So this is the main question, which is raised not only at the level of France only, but also at the level of Europe. So I would like to end my brief introduction with what Pierre-Jean thought in his introduction to the seminar, when he told that a good articulation of the European regulator framework and its transposition in the member states' laws is one of the key factors in the successful of ultra-fast broadband rollout in Europe. So I think it's time to assess this assertion, and this is what we will do. At first, with taking a distance and to see, and just to see what is the solution, what is the problem at the level of Europe, at the European level, and after that we will come back to particular state. This time Italy and France, because this transposition at the state level is raising a lot of problems, and one of the main problem is the relationship between state and local authorities. Because and in fact in France today, you know probably that the relationship between state and local authorities is problematic, and also because states are different from an institutional point of view, but also in their empirical reality. So this is important to have a comparative analysis. And so this is what we start just now with Mark. Mark, I will let you the floor. Mark is a professor at Telecom Paris and also joint academic director of the Center on Regulation in Europe. Mark, it's to you to play.
Thank you, Patrice. So I'm going to use some slides. So I don't know if you can present the first slide. Okay, thank you. So thank you for this invitation and thank you for this opportunity to talk today on this great topic, fascinating topic that I've been interested in the last years too. So in this talk, I want to do something specific, which is to provide an overall picture of the state aid regime in Europe through the lens of a quantitative analysis of the notifications addressed to the European Commission over the last 15 years. So if you can present the next slide, please. So this analysis, this quantitative analysis, has been conducted with my colleagues Richard Fizzi and Ambre Nicole. It has been published first as a report of the Center on Regulation in Europe, the CER, and recently it has been published also as an article in the journal Telecommunications Policy. So you can look at the report or the paper for more information about what I'm going to talk about. So what I'm going to start with is to briefly discuss why we may need public investment, which is, I think, the core topic or the central issue in this session today, and what is state aid. And then I will answer a number of questions about state aid in Europe using data about the state aid notifications addressed to the European Commission. First, who has been using state aid among member states? What kind of projects are supported by state aid? Why state aid? So that is what is the main motive behind state aid notifications, and how state aid measures have been designed. And finally, I will look at the question of when, that is at which stage of market development the state aid kicks in European member states. So the first question is why we may need public investment. So the use of public funds to support deployment of broadband rests upon the assumption that access to high capacity network is an important enabler of economic activity and social inclusion. This is because broadband can stimulate growth through productivity gains for the firms that adopt this technology, but broadband can also generate important spillovers or externalities for the economy and the society as a whole that go beyond the simple usage of the technology. So for example, broadband infrastructure can stimulate innovation in new products and services by startups. So these social benefits of broadband suggest a role for public funds. And why it's so? It's because the private firms that act under market conditions are not able to fully internalize, to fully capture the economic value of the broadband technology and the social benefits and the externalities that it generates. So as a consequence, what may happen is that investment by the private sector may fall short to the level of investment that would be desirable for our societies. So public funds can then be used to fill this gap from this form of market failure. And so what is state aid here? So state aid is a set of rules set up by the European Union that aim to ensure that when member states use public funds to support certain activities, so it can be broadband here, but it can be other activities too, they do not give particular private companies an unfair competitive advantage over others, because this would distort competition and would be harmful for the economy and for the consumers. So anyway, some distortion of competition is always likely to occur when some firm receives state aid funds and others do not. So the state aid rules, what they do is that they require the application of a balancing test under which the harmful effects of the aid are kept minimum while achieving the intended outcomes. So for example, for broadband in terms of deployment of the technology. And any proposed stated measure should meet these conditions to be approved by the European Commission. So what we did for the broadband technology and the broadband market at the Center on Regulation in Europe was to collect data in 2018 on broadband stated measures in Europe by downloading all the notification letters addressed to the European Commission between 2003 and 2018 for approval by the European Commission. So we analyzed those letters looking for relevant information, and we built a data set that contained a lot of data about what is stated in Europe, at least over the last 15 years. So interestingly enough, so it had never been done before. And so we were the first to provide this overall picture of broadband stated plans in Europe. So let me give you some general information about broadband stated in the EU. So it started in the mid-2000s, but it accelerated since then. So our estimate is that each year public funds represent about 7 billion euros of investment in broadband. And by comparison, the private sector, by our estimates too, spends about 25 billion euros per year in investment in broadband infrastructure. So overall, our estimate is that the public funds represent about 20% of investment in broadband in Europe. A second interesting figure is that we estimate that Europe spends less than 5% of its budget on broadband. So even though broadband is deemed to be a priority in Europe, it does not really show up in the amount of public money spent, at least in percentage of the funds that are available in Europe. So now let me go through a number of questions that we ask ourselves when looking at the data to understand what is actually stated in Europe in practical terms when we look at the stated measures adopted by various member states. The first question is who? So who has been using stated among member states? So what we find is a lot of heterogeneity between member states. So some of them are using stated and a large number of them are not. So more than half of the cases originate from a few large and heavily populated member states. So Germany, the UK, and Italy, and to lesser extent, France and Spain. So in numbers of notifications. In the overall budget allocated to broadband by with public funds, we obtain the same picture, even though Italy and France are now the more important contributors in terms of public budget to broadband, followed by Germany, the UK, and Spain. And on this figure, what you see is stated expenditures per capita for each member state. And so you can see that France is a country where we have the largest expenditure of stated on a per capita basis by a significant margin. France is followed by Italy, which is also a significant user of public subsidy for broadband. And Germany and the UK have also notified significant public expenditures compared to other countries, but far lower on a per capita basis than France or Italy. So interestingly, the other member states spend much less in public funds for the deployment of broadband infrastructure. So the second question that I want to ask is what kind of projects are supported by state aid? So what we see is that the number of cases notified to the European Commission increased from 2003 to 2010, but has been decreasing since then. In terms of budget, the total value of stated expenditures has increased since 2010, while the number of notified cases was declining, as I said. And there are two reasons for that. So the first reason is that some countries have been notifying more and more what is called umbrella schemes, which includes many smaller measures. So this is the case for France, for example. And second, we also observe a transition towards the financing of next generation access networks capable of providing high-speed access to the internet. So next slide, please. So this figure shows this transition towards next generation access, or NGA projects, which offer high-speed access to the internet. As you can see on the figure, so which shows the share of notified measures for NGA, so in the total number of measures. as well as the absolute number of NGA measures. So you can see from the figure that until 2011, basic broadband represented the most common type of measure in the EU. And then there was a shift around 2011 towards NGA. So this is related to the Commission's attempt to steer state aid towards NGA rather than basic broadband. It can also be due to the fact that NGA networks were first rolled out by the private sector and then only started to be supported with public funds for their deployment in more costly areas starting from 2011. So another question that is interesting to ask is why state aid? So what is the main motive for state aid used for broadband networks? So in principle, public investment in broadband infrastructure could be undertaken for two different types of purposes. So the first one would be to extend coverage to more costly areas, in particular when the private sector is not expected to find viable to deploy a network without subsidy. And this corresponds to what is called usually the so-called white areas. And secondly, public investment could also be used instead of extending coverage to accelerate the rate of deployment of new broadband technologies in areas where private operators are deemed to be too slow, which would correspond to the so-called gray areas. So our analysis of the state aid measures in Europe over the last 15 years shows that state aid has remained largely confined to white areas. So in 86% of notifications, the projects concern only white areas. In 7% of them, the measures concern gray areas, and in 4% of them, the measures concern both white and gray areas. But the bottom line is that state aid in Europe has been used mainly for white areas. So the main objective that is revealed through this analysis is that state aid in Europe has the main objective to extend coverage rather than to accelerate the deployment of broadband or to intensify competition in some areas where the public sector would think that competition is not strong enough. So another question that we investigated in this research was how the state aid plans were designed. So there are a number of design issues, so I'm not going to go through all of them. So a first design issue is what type of state aid is provided to the project. So it can be subsidies, direct grants, but it could be also interest rate subsidies, guarantees, loans. And what we found is that direct grants is the most common form of financial support for these measures. Secondly, there are a number of rules that are imposed in the state aid guidelines. So one of them is that the member state should employ an open tender for the allocation of public funds. And we found that it is followed by a vast majority of the member states for their broadband measures. They sign contracts that last for 3 to 5 years, typically. What is interesting also is the type of network that is deployed and the type of organization for this network. So half of the project involve operations only at the upstream level. So the project aims at developing a wholesale-only operator, and the other half of the project concern companies that can operate both at the upstream, wholesale, and downstream level. There are wholesale obligations imposed in the majority of cases. We found also that in some cases there is some kind of retail price regulation that is envisioned in about a quarter of the measures. And typically it will take the form of some benchmarking with the prices that prevail in the competitive areas. So a last interesting aspect in this design of the state aid measures is the so-called clawback mechanism. So the clawback mechanism is the idea that it may happen that these public projects may generate excess profits. So for example, if demand appears to be higher than anticipated or deployment costs are lower than originally planned. So in this case, when the public project generates excess profits, there should be a clawback mechanism that, for example, will transfer back the excess profits to the public institution. So what is interesting is that it seems to be, so it's a requirement from the guidelines, but it's implemented in only 3/4 of the measures. So some measures don't even mention a clawback mechanism. The last question that I want to discuss today is when, so at which stage of market development stated kicks in. So because policymakers may be reluctant to intervene with public money if broadband coverage is still low and the potential for private investment seems high. So this first figure shows the number of notified cases against the level of basic broadband coverage at the time of the notification to the Commission. What you can see is that the vast majority of the notifications for basic broadband occurred once a member state had already achieved a coverage exceeding 95% of households. So this is consistent with the finding that I mentioned earlier, that the majority of notifications has the objective of extending coverage to white areas in which there is no prospect of private investment. Thus, for basic broadband, public investment seems to be concentrated to take over only when the private sector is really unable to invest. So next figure, please. Next slide. So we conducted the same exercise for state-led plans for high-speed broadband or NGA networks. And again, so this figure shows state-aid expenditure on NGA against NGA coverage. And we see that state aid for NGA has been used at a much earlier stage than state aid for basic broadband. So public investment here intervenes to promote NGA deployment when NGA coverage reaches about 70% of households. So there are different ways to analyze that and to interpret these findings. The first one is that it may reflect the view that private investment in high-speed broadband like NGA will be more limited than for basic broadband, so calling for public intervention at an earlier stage. This could also reflect some kind of impatience on the part of the policymakers. They may be reluctant to wait until the private sector has exhausted investment opportunities available to them, and the public sector may wish to accelerate the deployment through public funding. So in any case, so it has, I think, interesting implications for the use of state aid. So in particular, when we move to ultra-fast broadband and VHCN networks, then the opportunities for public investment will be probably even more limited, and therefore maybe calling for even stronger public intervention. At the same time, this finding also raises a concern that maybe public intervention may come too early in this market when possibilities of private investment are not totally exhausted. So in other words, public investment in high-speed broadband may crowd out private investment. So we used aggregate data for this study, and it does not allow us to go much beyond what I showed you today. In particular, we cannot be conclusive about the question of whether public funds crowd out or rather crowd in private investment. So at this moment, with colleagues at Telecom Paris, we are starting a research project that aims at answering this question with more fine-grained data on France. So this project is supported by France Stratégie, which I will take the opportunity to thank for that. And I hope we will be able to say more in the next months. So thank you.
Mark, for this very stimulating intervention. Just a few questions. One is, what is the main effects of public investment, better coverage or leverage effect?
So what we found is that in terms of objective, so it's not necessarily what is realized afterwards, in terms of objective ex ante of these measures, they aim at extending coverage rather than adding infrastructure where competition is deemed to be too soft, for example.
Last question for me. Just a question coming from Pierre-Jean. the indirect effects of state aid on competition between private companies and public organizations are most often discussed and evaluated. How could one also measure the consequences in terms of competition between states? Mark?
So this is a good question. So I
We
don't
told
have an easy answer to that. So there is a so we are talking about the European Union. So we should be together in Europe, but of course there is some competition between member states too. So for example, over the services that are provided over these technologies, and clearly for each member state deploying fast these infrastructures and with a high quality of service is critical for productivity gains, possibilities of innovation, and so on and so forth. Okay. So we see, so as discussed in the introduction, all these member states have, for example, different geographies, different history of telecommunications networks, different market structures, and also different regulatory paths sometimes. And so this is going to affect the deployment of these networks and eventually the gains for the economy and the society that can be derived from the deployment of this infrastructure. But so I think this is a very good question. I'm not aware, for example, of any empirical research that would provide evidence on this question, but this is a good question.
Okay, thank you very much. And now the floor is Harald Gruber. Harald, it's to you. And Harald is from the European Investment Bank, and he is the head of Digital Infrastructure Division. Harald.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you for this invitation to this very interesting conference. I've been following the previous sessions, a very, very good debate. I mean, this thing about state aid, I would like the perspective of somebody who is providing public sector support, like a public policy bank, like the European Investment Bank. And therefore, as a policy bank, we have clearly to look where market failures prevail, because otherwise we do not have really a good reason to intervene as a public policy bank. And when it comes to telecommunications or to broadband infrastructure, or even then to very high capacity infrastructure, you always have the usual problem that you have a market failure in peripheral areas. So nobody would, with basically market means, go out there to cover those areas because they're not financially profitable. So you have this market failure of primary rollout. You have seen it before in Mark's presentations, very interesting. So you see that public support, in particular state aid, is very useful to be employed in those kind of things. But the thing is that here you have to do with an infrastructure where you have very rapid technological innovation, which means that over time, the infrastructure you have built out once, like water or something, or electricity, in a few years, it's not enough. So you basically have to step up the technology, and therefore you have to step up the performance of the thing. So if you started out with basic telecom infrastructure, you had to now at the beginning of this century, you had to start out with next generation access. But next generation access is not enough either, because 30 megabits it's not good enough for the future. So you have to step it up again. And as a result of that, public policy makers have to set always goals. So you have two types of market failures in my view. One is basically the general market failure of the peripheral areas. And the other market failure is when the market are not providing the infrastructure at the speed as the policy makers would entail. Now, let's be concrete now. Now we have that digital agenda was fixing the performance targets for 2020. So there should be universal type of access to 30 megabits per second. But now we are in 2020. We have achieved to a large degree this objective. But in the meantime, clearly that's not good enough. So the Commission has set a new goal. By 2025, everybody should have access to 100 megabits per second. So the infrastructure that was previously rolled out is probably not enough. So, and I will come back later to this. So you have to go towards universal fiber type of infrastructure, which again, the market will be, okay, it will provide it, but not everybody will get it by the market, and certainly even less so by 2025. So it will be too little and too late if you leave it just to the market. Therefore, you have actually two reasons why you should use public support, be it state aid, be it the regulatory support, be all kind of support to basically to support the rollout of this infrastructure. At the European level, you have, as a result of that, established several support instruments. I mean, I'm listing there a few on the slide, and also for the next financial framework, there will be the red ones will be in place there also to basically complement what is already done. Please, next slide. But at the end, you have to figure out, once you to fix a target, what would be the bill of this policy target? I mean, how much is actually, under reasonable assumptions, the cost of the rollout of this infrastructure? We at the bank have done a relatively recent study about what would it entail if we would like to pursue the policy objectives of the gigabit society. So basically providing everybody with 100 megabits per second by 2025, and also fulfill the 5G rollout according to the 5G strategic plan of the European Commission. And so basically, there in the policy note, there are several sub-targets, and each of the sub-targets has its own bill. But at the end, the final bill is close to 400 billion for reasonable assumptions. You can make many assumptions about the thing. But the problem with that is that basically a substantial part of this bill cannot be provided by the market by 2025. Certainly not. So it's about only, if you leave the things to the market, only about 1/3 of this rollout would happen. So therefore, 2/3 of this bill, so it's about 250 billion, requires some form of public support. And that's where basically the policy agenda set in. So now, clearly, you have now to figure out how you deal with state aid regulations, because state aid regulation is still stuck with the old technology. And maybe if you look at next generation access, and basically the countries are more or less covered, everybody with NGA, so there's no reason for state aid anymore to support. So you have to update your state aid regulations. The problem is a little bit complicated because you're talking here about technology choices. At the end, you have to make choices about technology. Next slide, please. Now you have to figure out basically what technology is capable or is future-proof to provide this kind of performance. Clearly, if you put public money in hand, you want to make sure that you spend it well, and you spend it for a technology that is future-proof. So it's pointless to spend it in a technology after a few years is again obsolescent. This is particularly delicate in a fast-moving environment like broadband, like the digital infrastructure. So therefore, once you put your money into your hand, you want to be pretty sure that technologies are future-proof. This is an extremely delicate issue because clearly you have basically legacy infrastructures where basically the owner of that legacy infrastructure have legitimate interest to basically claim that their technology is equally valid. So BEREC is at this moment figuring out what are the technologies that should be qualifying for basically for being able to deliver the gigabit society targets. I mean, there is some technological formulation of how this kind of future-proof technology should look like. So it should be at least 100 megabit per second, but upgradable to 1 gigabit. So let's call it short. In my view, at the end, you need fiber. That's it. So there's little way around that. Once you put public money into place, public support should go basically towards fiber and to 5G. So that's basically the point of departure of my approach here. Now, next slide, please. If now you have to basically to figure out, what are the scenarios? Here in this graph you see the different scenarios on the technological choices. It's a fairly sophisticated paper which has a lot of. It's carried out at NUTS 3 level, so it's basically at a relatively distributed regional coverage. You can find that basically these under different assumptions you get different costs. And of course, you get the high bill and the low bill cost. So, but at the end, what you have is that the proportion of private support or private investment is always small, especially when it's relatively well doted with technology. Next slide, please. So the problem is now once you have support with state aid, the state aid current guidelines are basically entrenched in the next generation access network. So it's basically infrastructure that goes up to 30 megabits per second. Clearly there, it has very clear guidelines. So you have basically gray areas, white areas, the black areas. Black areas is no go for state aid. White areas is the thing that you should go for, and gray areas you don't know how you end up. So it's the thing. But as a benchmark, you have 30 megabits per second as what is out there. If the existing infrastructure is already there, then you have no scope for asking for public sector support. Now, in the meantime, also the regulatory framework has changed. We have now, since a year, the European Electronic Communication Code, which is entirely covered by next generation X, by very high capacity network. So it's the gigabit society type of network. So basically, on the regulatory side, the Commission has done its tasks. So basically, it has set the policy goal of the gigabit society, and we have now a regulatory framework that goes with it, which is supportive for that kind of infrastructure. But where we still need to have to catch up is basically with the state aid regulations. Because, give you an extreme example, you could have a black area where basically you have infrastructure which is getting to about 30 megabits per second, but none of the operators has 100 megabits per second. So, from a NGA perspective, from a very high capacity network perspective, it is a non-covered area. It is basically what is called in the new framework a designated area. So formerly black areas, they could well be designated areas with the new framework. So therefore, they could be qualifying, if you want, for state aid. So this is basically as a result of this very fast technological evolution. You would also have to have a very fast change in your framework for state aid, and also in general for public support. And this is one of the challenges that I can see over the next years, that we have to get a grip on defining, first of all, what are technologies that qualify for this new frame, and how we should spend our basically public support for this kind of infrastructures. So, next slide, please.
Yes, briefly, thank you. Next slide.
So, basically, just to sum it up, so from a public support, what an institution like the European Investment Bank is providing, basically, the challenge always is what are the kind of things that can be done to a large degree by the bank. So basically, you have large infrastructure on a basically sort of well urbanized areas, where basically you have sort of, it's not too difficult to provide lending to those kind of things. You can also provide a sort of financing on market basis to those areas. But where it becomes extremely risky is that if you have relatively small infrastructure like local communities which are setting up very high capacity infrastructure, and basically with small projects. For this kind of projects, there you need very intense public sector support. So basically it could be state aid, it could be all kind of subsidized loans or other regulatory measures which help out on the thing. So basically to summarize is that we need to think in a very careful way about what should be the financial instruments, apart also from straight state aid, which could leverage state aid in providing the huge investments amount that I mentioned to you before, because it's about 250 billions that need to be supported somehow in some way. So therefore, you need to basically spend your public money in a very smart way. So to sum up, I think it is a very challenging period that we are in there. There is a huge need out there for having very high capacity infrastructure. I mean, we see it also now, precisely in this period, that we are doing this conference not in the same place, but over the networks. That basically the resilience of our economy is very much dependent on the performance of our digital infrastructure. And spending money in digital infrastructure is money well spent. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Quickly, a question from Pierre-Jean again. Pierre-Jean? Hello, Pierre-Jean?
No, I just let you make all the question if you wish. Actually, I had a couple of questions. The first one is that in France, at least, many opponents of the digital strategies argue that 30 megabytes is enough and that we don't really need 100 for all, and a fortiori 1 gigabit by second. What economic argument do you put forward at the level of the European Investment Bank to support this NGA project in face of such opposition?
I mean, there are basically
Thank you, Pierre-Jean.
arguments. I mean, there is basically empirical evidence that performance of infrastructure pays off economically. I mean, there are studies out there. I mean, they're not. I mean, it is something that's still at the beginning, but normally what you find in such kind of empirical studies is that performance is paying off. And second, basically, there is a policy consensus about it. Let's face it. All member states have signed up to that, and it makes perfect sense. So therefore, of course, there will always be somebody who puts brake on because they say, I don't need it. It's enough for me. But it is, if the general economy believes that this is anyway necessary, and anyway, those who are late, they will be paying for the lateness, and you can't change overnight the infrastructure. It's not something that you can roll out in a couple of years. It takes 10 years to roll it out in a capillary way. And as we have seen also, I mean, you may remember when there was the thing about 3G. When 3G, companies paid huge license fees for having a 3G license, but then they were stuck because they didn't know what to do with it. It took time till smartphones came up, and then it was necessary, and it was not even enough. So once you have the technology out there, once you have infrastructure out there, you will see that very soon, and especially if it's of the universal type, applications will arrive. I mean, you can see it also now. You could have distance learning. I think it would be extremely helpful if schools could provide their services in a sort of an interactive way, in a capillary way. So I think there are plenty of reasons why you should have this kind of infrastructure.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, if I can make a very short question. When you mention the designated areas, I'm not sure to understand very clearly. Shouldn't we make a difference between the state aids aim at the appropriation and effective implementation of high-speed broadband in this area. And on the other hand, the state aid aiming at elsewhere at the rollout of the infrastructure itself. That means in the framework you presented, shouldn't we make a differentiation between the different lines of it?
The risk is that you have overlapping regimes then, and then you have to make choices. My approach would be basically that you go immediately for the highest target, and you make that as a reference point, because it comprehends the previous ones. But certainly you will have sometimes very heavy discussions with legacy infrastructure holders, which may feel that they're taking for a ride. So you can have this kind of discussions. But again, if you have the opportunity, I think you should always aim for the highest target.
Okay, thank you. Last question from my neighbor.
Yeah, it's a question for Marc Bourreau from the chat. It's a question coming from Hungary. The question is, why do you don't have any data for Hungary? Despite Hungary start in 2015 a super fast internet program with state aid more than 100 million euro, and why do you do not have data for Hungary? It's for Marc.
Yes, but unfortunately, I'm wondering whether Marc didn't leave.
Yes, Marc has gone away. Okay.
So we know him quite well, so we should have the opportunity to ask him later.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Okay, now we will contextualize this state aid in two countries. First of all, Italy, with Francesco Nono, with the director of regulatory affairs in Open Fiber, and after Marie Lamoureux in France. Francesco.
Hello, hi all. Thanks for inviting us to tell you what is going on in Italy, and in particular, what are our views about investment in very high capacity network. Just a few words about Open Fiber, because probably most of the audience, probably with the exception of Harald, who funded us, so he studied quite well our initiative, but most of the audience doesn't know Open Fiber very well. Please change the slide. Now, Open Fiber is a company that has been funded in 2016 and has an objective to cover 9.5 million property units in black and gray areas, and has therefore won three different tenders for public aid in white areas, covering 9.6 million property units. So our plan comprises of 19 million of property units. We have already built about 9. And we are using a lot the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive. We are using a lot existing ducts and poles that we reuse to build our network. Please go on next slide. Since Open Fiber entered the market, it revived it with a lot of investment. And the coverage of FTTH in Italy increased last year of 6 percentage points from the about 2 it was in the past. So our presence is strong, and last year we invested around 1 billion euros only in FTTH in Italy. Please, next slide. I'll go quite fast. just to tell you that the company is going on with its plans steadily. We moved from 2.4 households passed in 2017, and we began with 1.2 that since there was a merger among Fiber and Metroweb, that was a company that had already built all Milan and partially Turin and Bologna. So we began 1.2, we were at 2.4 in 2017, 5.1 2018, about 8 at the end of last year. So the pace is about 3 million households covered each year. The capex has reached 1 billion last year, and this year will be probably around 1.2, 1.3 billion euros. Revenues are clearly much behind because we are investing heavily, but we are just begun to sell, so but it's increasing. So the company is in its first years, but it's going on very quickly. Please, next slide. Just one point, because we are talking here about funds. Open Fiber has a lot of private funding, even if it has won public tenders. The public funds amount to about 23% of the overall funding of Open Fiber, while the rest are loans by shareholders or equity and private fundings. Now, why is the public funding so low? Because the private initiative is all completely privately funded. The public initiative is only partially publicly funded because the kind of tender that was used in Italy didn't fund it completely. Even it was a direct intervention, the tender was made in a way that pushed you to take part of the risk that you should recover in the next 20 years managing the network you build. So if a network costs 10, when you bid, you offer, let's say 7, 6, 5 that you request as public funding, and the rest is the risk you take to recover it through the management of the network in the next years. I think it's clear. If it's not, I will answer your question later. Please, next slide. Okay, this was as Open Fiber. Now, quickly, we have a lot of initiatives, and I heard Mark Bourreau before making a difference among broadband funding and ultra broadband funding, NGA and VHCN funding. Now, the point is that since this has become a public objective in 2010, there has been a shift in the public initiatives, and the public initiatives are meant to build networks, not to complete coverage. Now, the fact that we discuss about white, gray, and black areas depends on the fact that in 2013, we had the guidelines on state aid for broadband by DG Competition that introduced this differentiation. And it was meant to facilitate intervention in white areas where no one was willing to invest. But apart from that, it still leaves a lot of uncertainty about how to intervene in gray areas. Now, all these initiatives we had pushed a lot investment in NGA and VHCN networks. Next slide, please. What happened in Italy? Now, in 2016, entered Open Fiber, and we had a national plan following the European plan, the digital agenda. In the years 2017 to 2019, we had on the market a reactive co-investment plan by the incumbent and another player, TIM and Fastweb, to cover 29 cities. We had an acceleration of fiber to the cabinet coverage by TIM, and at the same time, the award of all public tenders to open fiber. Now, what is happening this year is that on one side, the public is funding vouchers to facilitate the migration to NGA, MVA, VHC networks, and the other side, it is willing to begin a new public intervention to cover gray areas with very high connectivity networks. Let's go. Please, next slide. Okay, thank you. We had a public consultation about the intention of investments in gray area, and following the description that Harald made us, it's a mess to mix up the kind of infrastructure and the coloring of the areas, black, gray, etc. So we have black VHN, gray VHN, white, it's always white, fortunately, that does not make a difference. But of course, what is happening is that it is difficult to distinguish what can be funded and what cannot, following the guidelines and following the European Electronic Communication Code. Of course, there are areas that are intended to be eligible for aid that are not clearly eligible for aid under present guidelines that are fortunately under review. A second point is that the Italian experience is stressing a big difficulty in relying on the declaration of investments of private operators. Because of course, when you talk about building new networks and not completing a coverage, but doing a coverage, because when we talk about very high capacity network, the level of actual coverage is very low. In Italy, we are about 20%. So we have to build the national coverage. Of course, private investors tend to over-declare their intention to invest and reduce the risk that there is a public intervention in an area of possible interest. What happened is therefore that the percentage of VHN networks that we had reached at the end of 2019 was 23%. You can see it in the low part of the slide towards the end. And the expected coverage by the end of 2022 has been declared to be 77.2%. Now, this is fantastic, should be an excellent result if it is respected. But this looks like a lot as an over-declaration, because
4 minutes, Francesco.
Okay, but I'm almost there. So what we think is that to face a proper way to guarantee a public intervention, some changes in the guidelines are quickly needed. And I talk about the guidelines on state aid. Next slide, please. Okay, no, let's go to the other one again, another one. Okay. We saw that the historic track record of the public consultation shows that the infrastructure programs declared by private operators are very optimistic. I didn't show the previous slide, but you can find on it how much time more than expected it is taking to respect previous declaration. It is typically 4 to 5 years. Complete the investment declared requires 4 to 5 years more than the initial declaration. So it's quite a long time. And in fact, if you check the effective situation, you highlight a strong imbalance between the investment plans and the real broadband coverage achieved every year. This reflects the fact that the declarations are not binding or subject to any sanction regime. So we should find a new way to manage the public intervention, because if the money need is so much, and Harald gave us a figure of how much the investment gap is big. And if we want to use this public money, we have to find a way to avoid this situation that is not in the public interest. If the public interest is to achieve the policy objective, we have to avoid that there is an incentive not to cooperate in this direction. Now, just to conclude, if you can swap to the next slide, we have to ensure a greater balance between public and private initiatives for the deployment of the ultra-broadband networks. I mean that if there is a serious private intention to invest, of course there should not be any kind of private or public investment. But in the other case, we should be able to use the public money in order to reach the policy objective. Second, there should be some kind of effective monitoring mechanisms on investment decisions issued by the private operators. I don't want to say that they have to be sanctioned, but at least if they do not what they have declared, there should be a way for the state to intervene. And a third point I wanted to highlight, in a lot of cases, there are partial declaration of areas. What do I mean? If you take a city, you declare that you will cover the center of the city, but not the peripheral areas of the same city. So you put under the tender only peripheral areas. This is very costly to cover because you have to go through the center anyway. And so it should be analyzed a better way to use the public money, because otherwise you make tenders that are not efficient for the market. That's all for me. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Francesco. Just a few questions quickly. So slide number 5, what is the role of local authority in the public investment? Could you precise it, maybe?
Pardon, slide 5. What is the role of? Local
authorities.
No, unfortunately in Italy, we have no any kind of intervention by local authorities. Lot of the funds we are using, public funds, were regional funds, European regional funds, but their management has been concentrated under the supervision of the ministry. So we have no local authorities involved, even if I must say that it would be helpful to have local authorities involved, because central government is too far from the needs of local municipalities and industries in specific areas. So it would be easier to accelerate where there is a most urgent need if we had the direct relationships with local authorities. Unfortunately, they're not taking part at all to the process.
Very concrete questions to has the Commission sent a request to Italy to justify the public subsidies to open fiber under the state aid rules?
The Commission approved the initiative a few years ago in 2016, and I'm not aware of any requests, subsequent requests.
Yes, I asked the question because it was a similar situation in France where there was a formal approval at the beginning, but when we received 2 or 3 years ago a formal request for evaluation because under the state aid rules, the country should justify their investment after the rollout.
I know that the Infracred, it is this company controlled by our Economic Development Ministry, has awarded a tender to a national company in order to go on with the evaluation process that is necessary, as you, Pierre-Jean, just said. But it has just begun, so I'm not aware of any result of any evaluation by this company.
Well, thank you very much, Francesco, again. Now, Marie, it's to you. Marie, the floor is yours, and Marie Lamoureux is here to represent. She represents Federation of Fiber Industries.
Yeah,
Marie,
maybe just a word before you begin, Marie. We shall continue until 2 o'clock in order, of course, to give you enough time to make your presentation and to have some discussion. So it just to make people aware.
oh, that was okay.
If I do not start before, but okay. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you all today and the possibility to exchange with people under the very difficult circumstances, people I haven't seen for months now, so I'm very happy to be here with you. So I'm here on behalf of Infranum. Infranum is a trade association representing the digital industry, especially focused on rural rollout and usage in France. So gathering operators, vendors, and subcontractors active in those areas. So in France, I think now I also saw the intervention of Guillaume Mélier from ARCEP, so you have a good knowledge of the French experience. But I would start, maybe you can go to next slide. I only have 2 slides, so the slide is just to illustrate the discussion. So in France, we started with a very high ambition, so an ambition to cover 100% of households by 2025, and an ambition that has been recently confirmed by the government following the COVID crisis and the apparent need for a very good coverage of a good connection. We have a national plan based on a very organized mix of private and public money. So it started with private areas, and especially with the launch of call for initiative to invest in less dense areas. So as you see in the middle of my slide, what we call medium density areas. This call was two operators participated. So Orange, the incumbent, and SFR, and they committed to invest and roll out a fiber network covering close to 15 million households by 2022. As Francesco was saying before, having clear commitment from operator was also something that France wanted to have. So we have actually a law that is allowing the government to accept commitment from binding commitment from operators, and ARCEP, so the regulator, is entitled to monitor those commitments, and with the possibility to fine private operator if they do not respect their commitment. And the rest of the country, so the places with the market failure or where there was no private project, no private initiative, so that cover close to 17 million households, so the largest part of the country, where public money was used to trigger investment and rollout. So what happens in those areas? We have local authorities who are responsible for the planification of the networks. So this responsibility has been given to those authorities by law more than 15 years ago. So we have a lot of experience on this now. So first, it was used to extend unbundling and so to enhance competition. And now it's used to extend FTTH coverage and to roll out FTTH networks. So in these areas, we use what we call RIP. So it's public initiative networks that are subject to contract between the local authority and a private operator, and the contracts have a duration for between 15 to 30 or 35 years, so long-term contracts. And as you said before, Francesco, for Italy, the principle is to share the risk of rolling out and operating the network. So the subsidy is not complete for all the investments that you have to put on the table, but only for a small part. I will come back on that after. Now we have more than 100 projects in France, and we can say that we are at the end of the planification because we only have 3 or 4 remaining projects, but the rest has been contracted with private operators. The use of the money is made in line with the EU guidelines, so no network duplication and having open access networks, so one shared network in a de facto monopoly for the private operator. And what we have witnessed in France is the emergence of new category of operator, as we see in Italy and in some other parts of the EU now, with operator only active on the wholesale market. So compared to the copper lines where we had only the incumbent owner of the network, now we have the incumbent, its main competitor, and also 2 or 3 wholesale only operators. So also a new competition at the infrastructure level, even though Orange will still retain more than 60% of the line in the market. This is good news for public money also, because all this competition to be able to be the owner and to roll out the network, plus the public money, which created previsibility for the market on the long run. Over time, we witnessed an increase of the private contribution for those areas, and a decrease of the cost, for the FTTH network. And as an example, the last version, so of the cahier des charges, so the requirement published by the state to put money in the local project. So the last version, in this last version, we saw that the private part for those kind of projects has doubled around time. So it was 400 euros per line at the beginning, and now it's supposed to be 800 euros. So it's very good news also for public money. And this organization, my second slide, the results now. So after many years of being the very bad pupil of the EU class, France, with FTTH, now we started to see a very good result for the rollout. So according to IDAT, a study made for the FTTH Council a few months ago, we saw that France was the leader now in terms both in terms of rollout and in terms of subscribers for September 2018 to September 2019. And now in the last result published by ARCEP, we saw 20 million connectable households. So a very good result for Q2 2020, despite the COVID crisis. And in the rural areas, more than 4 million lines now connectable, and a rhythm of 5 million lines, as you can see in my slide, 5 million lines per year. And it's, well, in 2020, we anticipated in July an impact of more than 1.5 million lines in 2020 with the COVID crisis, and in fact, the impact will be even lower than what we expected. So very good news. And on the take-up side, now we have more than 8 million subscribers in France, so a penetration rate of 40%. So also a very good news on this side as well. So to sum up, after I think France started maybe a bit more in advance than other countries. So we could say that the French organization has created really a virtuous circle for both public and private initiative, and has really accelerated private investment, both in the private initiative areas and in the public initiative areas, and given gave the long-term previsibility needed to attract other type of investors, which is also good for competition on the long term. And if I may, now in France, we the question that remains for public money is the very expensive lines. So the line where the connection is very the length of the connection is very significant, or the cost to be able to connect one or two subscriber is very high. And now, so the government is proposing to put on the table more than 200 million just to be able to finance those lines, which is a very good news for the next steps.
Thank you very much, Marie. Just a question. Last session, we spoke about the question of how to increase the demand size and the take-up of ultra-fast broadband. From your point of view of industrial, do you think that public investment is needed to improve the demand size?
The French experience shows that the take-up is here for residential customer, because once you started to have neighbors with FTTH offers, and you managed to keep a competitive retail market, then the demand is here. The question now in France is businesses, because the take-up for businesses is still very low. We believe that there are only 20% of businesses that are now connected to fiber, which compared to what we have on the mass market is very, very low. And it's a pity really with the COVID crisis and everything. We need businesses to be able to migrate also on fiber. And on this, maybe this is one of the proposal of Infranum for the state to subsidize the connection of small businesses if the connection is a bit costly. So that's maybe something that would be useful from the state. And then we will also discuss the switch off of the copper network, which might also incentivize migration.
Thank you very much. Last question coming from Pierre-Jean. Are there and how could they be characterized synergies and spillover effects between the deployments in the different zones in terms of engineering and the ecosystem of subcontracting companies? Okay, I repeat.
Yes. No, I think there is a dual effect. For sure, the rural rollout is happening after the private rollout, so we can benefit from experience of the 2 or 3 years before. Also for the organization of the main subcontractors in the country. But at the same time, there is a lack of training in France. Now the demand for technician is very, very high. And there is a kind of competition sometimes between areas to be able to attract the contractors, subcontractors. So there is also something to be done by the state on training to ensure that we have the right competencies and skills in the country.
Thank you very much, Marie, and all of you for your very stimulating interventions. Just I would like to conclude just in asking a more general question. Well, how we see today, in addition of economic development, the ultra-fast broadband is probably one of the new phases of land use planning. And land use planning is today not only the furniture of equipment, it engages also support policy. What about these support policies? And so from this point of view, I would like to ask a question about the collective action. What can we say about the coherence of all the actors? They are very numerous, the actions and the associated investment. And because one may wonder about the existence of a clear and shared vision of a gigabit society. Now, Pierre-Jean, a few words to conclude this first seminar, maybe.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll be very, very short because it's already quite late. Okay, thank you very much. It's really sincere for all the contributors, Harald, Francesco, Marie, you Patrice, for this session, but also for all the session and also the support team and Anne, the first round. For organizing this seminar. All the replays and the proceedings will be available on the website. You have the address on the slide. You have also on the website access to a preliminary report made by the mission, evaluation mission of French situation, with a first state of the art of the French situation, literature review on the question we discuss on this seminar. And for us, this seminar is just the beginning of following work. In the future, we intend to continue this seminar on different topics. The first one is more specific. It regards the island and overseas territories who raise a specific question. There will be also a seminar dedicated to the corporate and business markets, the B2B, which is very important in France. It's broadly 1/3 of the global telecommunication market, and with specific difficulty for regulation. And the last one will be also a workshop dedicated to the uses and practices and appropriation, because of course, but Harald mentioned that, it's no use to have infrastructure if you don't have the application and the use to develop and to use this technology. Similarly, we also have a couple of research which began some months ago. One with Marc Bourreau, who presented earlier. One dedicated to the corporate market. One dedicated to the evaluation of the local economic impact of the rollout. And one also, we have also some reflection regarding the impact of the governance and which kind of organization is at stake, and in which extent can it contribute to the efficiency of the infrastructure. So this is a series of activity. So I hope we shall have, and I'm sure we shall have, further opportunity to continue this discussion. So thank you very much for you, Harald, Francesco, Marie, and all the other contributors. And thank you for the attendance. You have been quite numerous in this 4th session. So, Anne, maybe the last very final word.
Well,
Yes, just two words, because on behalf of France Stratégie, yes, I will thank you, all of you speakers from today's session, but also from the previous session. And I have a special thanks to the moderators, Patrice, but also Fatima, Jacques Kremer, and Frédéric Marty. You already said all about our assessments program, which continue. And thank you very much for Harald and Francesco and Marie for your very precious information. So just if you need to see again all this 4th session, everything is webcast on our site, France Stratégie, in English and with French subtitled for French audience. So thank you again very much, and we hope we can see you all folks in Paris one day.
Yeah, see you certainly soon for new adventures. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.